In tonight's episode, we're diving into two of the darkest and most disturbing legends ever whispered across Asia. Stories that blur the line between superstition and reality, between folklore and fear. The first takes us deep into Thailand, where black magic rituals have lingered in the shadows for centuries, hidden away in temples, graveyards, and the hands of those desperate enough to pay the price. This story is not about a ghost that simply wanders through the night or a haunted house where footsteps echo in empty rooms. No. This is about something much more unsettling. An object that people willingly kept close to them. A substance pulled from the dead, bottled, and carried like a weapon or a charm. They called it Nam Man Phrai. To some, it was a key to power, love, and fortune. To others, it was a cursed oil that demanded blood and loyalty. It was said to make the most stubborn lover fall at your feet, the unluckiest gambler strike gold, or the strongest enemy collapse under invisible weight. But behind every whispered promise of success and desire, there was a warning no one could ignore. Because the oil was never truly yours, it belonged to the dead, and the dead always come back to collect. The story begins with a man named Aaron, a quiet antiques dealer from Bangkok, who often found himself traveling into remote villages in search of rare charms and forgotten relics. To most, he was just another collector who bartered for old amulets and Buddhist talismans. But Arun had a secret. For years, he had been fascinated by the forbidden side of Thai superstition, the black magic objects whispered about in markets but never placed on display. Objects like shrunken heads, bones carved with incantations, and bottles of oil said to hold the essence of the dead. It was on one of these trips that Arun heard the name Nam Man Phrai spoken for the first time. He was walking through a cramped night market, the kind where stalls leaned into one another and incense smoke mixed with the smell of fried food. A hunched vendor, her hands blackened with candle wax, asked if he was looking for something stronger than amulets. Arun was used to such pitches, but her voice had a tremble, as if she wasn't supposed to speak of it. When she finally leaned in and whispered the words, he felt an involuntary shiver. Nam Man Phrai, the oil of the dead. Aaron knew the stories, everyone in Thailand did, but hearing it spoken in the open, hearing it offered as if it were real, made him hesitate. He told himself he was only curious, that this was another myth to chase, another story to prove or disprove. Yet, as he left the market that night, her words clung to him like smoke. A week later, he found himself traveling toward a village in the Aizen region, guided by a name scribbled on a piece of paper the vendor had slipped into his pocket. The bus ride was long, the windows caked with dust, and the farther he traveled, the more the city noise gave way to silence. By the time he stepped off onto the dirt road, the sun had nearly set, and shadows stretched long across the rice fields. The village was small, almost forgotten. Wooden houses leaned under the weight of age, their tin roofs rattling with every shift of the wind. Children stared at him from doorways, their eyes wide but cautious, as though they had seen his type before. Strangers didn't come here unless they were searching for something, and what Arun was searching for was not meant to be found. He was led to a small house at the edge of the village, its walls scorched black from years of candle smoke. Inside lived an old monk-turned-sorcerer, a man who no longer wore saffron robes but instead wrapped himself in faded cloth, muttering incantations even when no one was there to hear them. This was the man who, according to rumor, could still make Nam Man Phrai the old way. The air inside the house was suffocating, thick with the smell of melted wax and something else, something sour, like spoiled meat hidden just beneath the floorboards. Arun sat cross-legged, his hands resting on his knees, while the sorcerer studied him through cloudy eyes. "Do you know what it costs?" the old man asked finally. His voice was brittle, like twigs snapping underfoot. Arun swallowed and nodded. He had heard the legends. That, to make Nam Man Phrai, one had to find a corpse of someone who had died violently, that the oil was drawn from the chin or forehead of the body with a candle, each drop collected while the sorcerer whispered forbidden prayers. It was not just oil. It was hunger, bottled and bound, but never truly tamed. Arun told himself he only wanted to see it, to prove that it was real. But deep down, there was another reason. Business had been poor. Collectors were losing interest in the same old amulets. If he could bring back something different, something legendary, he might finally rise above the struggling dealers in Bangkok's crowded markets. Outside, the night deepened, and the insects grew loud. Inside, the sorcerer leaned forward and lit a single black candle. Its flame flickered against the walls, throwing long shadows across jars that Arun hadn't noticed before. Jars that seemed to contain something more than wax or herbs. The air pressed in heavier, and Arun felt a chill creep into his bones. He had come searching for an object. But what he was about to discover was not an object at all. It was a presence, and it was waiting. Arun stayed seated on the mat as the sorcerer's black candle sputtered and hissed. The flame was weak, as though it fought against an unseen draft, even though the air in the room was thick and unmoving. The sorcerer did not speak for a long time. He only stared at the flame, lips twitching, as though silently mouthing words Arun couldn't hear. Arun shifted uncomfortably, his knees aching from sitting cross-legged, but he didn't dare interrupt. Finally, the old man asked, "Do you smell it?" Arun froze. He had noticed something since stepping into the house, but he had tried to ignore it. At first it was faint, like rancid oil left too long in a pan. But now, with the candle burning, the odor thickened, sweet, sour, and sharp all at once. It clung to the back of his throat, making him want to cough. He nodded slightly. The sorcerer smiled without showing his teeth. "Good, you should smell it. That means you are not blind to it." Arun didn't understand. He opened his mouth to ask, but the man raised a hand to silence him. Then he leaned forward and slid a small clay jar across the mat. The jar was stained dark, its surface slick with wax drippings. Arun hesitated, then placed his fingers on it. The moment he touched it, the air shifted. The insects outside went quiet, leaving only the sound of his own breath. The sorcerer's eyes narrowed. "It does not like strangers." Arun immediately pulled his hand back. His heart was pounding faster than it should for something so small. The jar sat between them, unremarkable in shape, yet heavy in presence, as though it had weight far beyond clay. He tried to steady himself, tried to remind himself he had touched countless artifacts before, but never had he felt something pulse back. The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. That jar once belonged to a gambler, a desperate man who wanted fortune more than he wanted his own life. He fed it with offerings for a year, chickens, incense, even drops of his own blood, and for a time, it gave him what he wanted. But one night, he forgot. He left the jar alone. When he woke the next morning, his house was empty. His wife, his children, all gone. Only the jar remained, sitting where they used to sleep. Arun tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and brittle. The sorcerer did not laugh with him. Instead, he pushed the jar closer. "Hold it." Arun shook his head. He had no reason to hold it. He only wanted to see, to confirm the legends. But before he could form an excuse, the flame on the black candle snapped, spitting a curl of smoke. And just then, the jar shifted. Not much, just the tiniest scrape across the mat. But Arun saw it. He knew he saw it. He recoiled instantly, his hands pressing against his thighs to stop them from shaking. The sorcerer's cloudy eyes followed the jar with something almost like approval. "You see," the old man murmured, "it is awake tonight." Arun tried to convince himself he was imagining it. Maybe the wooden floor beneath the mat was uneven. Maybe his nerves made it seem alive. But When he glanced again, he noticed something that made the air catch in his lungs. A faint, greasy smear was spreading outward from the jar's lid. Not liquid exactly, but something that glistened in the flickering light. It slid across the surface of the clay as though it had its own will, curling like fingers stretching after sleep. Arun's instinct was to get up and leave, but his curiosity chained him to the spot. He wanted to ask what was inside, but part of him already knew the answer. The sorcerer reached into the folds of his cloth and produced a small knife. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pricked the tip of his finger and let a single drop of blood fall onto the jar. The reaction was immediate. The greasy film retracted, sucking the blood into itself. The candle flame bent sharply, almost horizontal, before returning upright. Aaron's mouth was dry. He wanted to believe it was a trick. But no trick could explain the silence pressing in from outside, the way even the crickets had vanished from the night air. The sorcerer looked at him with steady eyes. If you wish to carry Nam Man Phrai, you must understand. It hungers. Always. You do not command it. You only feed it. And if you do not... He let the words trail off, leaving only the scrape of the jar as he slid it back toward the shadows. Arun realized then that he was no longer here as an observer. He was a participant, drawn into a ritual he hadn't agreed to. The first complication was no longer about whether Nam Man Phrai was real. The question now was whether he had already gone too far to walk away. Aaron barely slept that night. He was given a small mat in the corner of the sorcerer's house, the single candle still burning low near the jars. Every time his eyes closed, he swore he heard something faint, a wet sound, like oil dripping onto wood, followed by a whisper he couldn't quite catch. When he opened his eyes, nothing moved, yet the shadows seemed thicker, and the air reeked faintly of smoke and rot. At dawn, he stepped outside for air. The village was waking slowly, smoke rising from cooking fires, roosters crowing from uneven rooftops. But the stairs unsettled him. Men carrying water buckets stopped mid-step when they saw him. Women herding children inside glanced at the amulet hanging around his neck, then quickly turned away. Arun had traveled enough to know the look. Fear, not curiosity. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of where he had slept. One older woman finally approached, her back bent with age, her eyes sharp and shining despite her wrinkles. She stopped just a few feet away and pointed a thin finger toward him. "Don't touch what he gives you," she said softly in Thai, almost a hiss. "Once you take it, it won't be yours anymore. It will be you who belongs to it." Before Arun could answer, another villager rushed over, pulled the woman away, and shook his head at Arun as if to warn him not to ask questions. Arun stood frozen. He didn't want to admit it, but the words lodged in his chest. Later that afternoon, the sorcerer summoned him back inside. The candle was burning again, though Arun hadn't seen anyone light it. The jars lined the wall, some sealed with wax, others crusted with soot. Arun noticed something he hadn't the night before. A jar larger than the rest. Its lid bound shut with red string. The knot looked fresh, almost wet, and every so often the lid seemed to pulse, rising ever so slightly before settling again. The sorcerer caught him staring. "That one is not for you." Aaron swallowed. "Why is it tied?" The old man did not answer. Instead, he slid a smaller jar toward him, the same one that had shifted the night before. Aaron instinctively pulled back, but the sorcerer only smiled. "It has already chosen you. You cannot walk away now." Aaron's skin crawled. "I didn't agree to anything." The man leaned forward, voice lowering to a rasp. "You stepped into this house. You sat before it. You touched it. That was enough." Arun wanted to argue, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the silence outside, broken only by a dog barking furiously before cutting off with a yelp. Maybe it was the way the candle flame had started leaning toward the jar again, as though drawn to it. Then came the second event. Small, but undeniable. The sorcerer pushed the jar closer, and Arun felt a sudden warmth rise from it. Not heat, but a pulse, like the rhythm of a heart. The clay surface was dry, yet his fingers tingled as if something beneath it pressed upward to meet him. He snatched his hand back, but the feeling remained in his fingertips, sticky, alive. Suddenly, a voice called from outside. A young man, maybe 20 at most, stood in the doorway. He wore a plain shirt, his hair unkempt, his expression tense. He spoke quickly, too fast for Arun to catch every word, but the anger in his voice was clear. The sorcerer's face darkened. Arun leaned closer, catching fragments. The youth was warning him, telling him not to take it, saying it had already destroyed too many lives in their village. That once someone carried Nam Man Phrai, misfortune followed, sometimes fortune at first, but always misfortune in the end. The sorcerer snapped at the boy, his words sharp, his voice filled with venom. The young man's face paled, but he didn't back away. He turned his gaze on Arun instead. His eyes were steady, urgent. "If he gives it to you," he said slowly, "bury it in the earth and run before night falls." Then he was gone, yanked back by another villager outside. Arun's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to demand answers, but the sorcerer's glare froze him in place. The candle sputtered again. This time, Arun saw it clearly. A thin trail of oil seeped from beneath the jar's lid, running down the side and dripping onto the mat. The stain spread wider, darker, soaking into the fabric as if feeding itself. The sorcerer reached out, wiped the oil with his finger, and pressed it to his lips. His eyes rolled back for a moment, and when they focused again, they locked on Arun. "Now, it is watching you," he whispered. Arun's stomach twisted. He no longer felt like a guest or even a participant. He felt trapped between two forces: the sorcerer, who insisted this was his fate, and the villagers, who begged him to flee before it was too late. The question hung heavy in his mind, one that refused to leave him. Was the jar alive, or was it already inside of him? Arun awoke in the dead of night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. For a moment he thought he had been dreaming, but the sound that tore him from sleep still lingered in the air. A low moan, deep and strained, not human yet, not fully animal either. It vibrated through the wooden walls, rattling the jars on the shelves. He sat upright on his mat, the single black candle still flickering though no one had lit it. The sorcerer was awake too, crouched before the largest jar bound with red string. His lips moved in frantic murmurs, his fingers smearing oil across the knot, as if sealing it tighter. The jar pulsed against the floor, its lid twitching with every muttered chant. Arun's chest tightened. He wanted to move, to leave, but his legs refused to obey. Instead, his eyes wandered across the room, straight to the smaller jar the sorcerer had claimed had chosen him. It was no longer where it had been left. It sat closer now, near the edge of his mat, as though it had crawled across the floor in his sleep. He told himself it wasn't possible. Maybe the sorcerer had moved it while he slept. Maybe he was imagining it. But when he leaned closer, he saw the trail it had left behind. A dark, oily streak dragged across the wooden floorboards, glistening in the candlelight like blood. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Arun gasped and pressed his sleeve to his nose, but it did nothing to block the smell. It was everywhere now, sweet and foul, like burning flesh and spoiled flowers. The sorcerer finally turned his head, his eyes wild, his face slick with sweat. "Do not touch it," he hissed. "It is awake." The jar inched again, just the faintest scrape, but enough to send Arun scrambling backward. His hand landed in something wet, and when he pulled it up, his fingers were coated in a thin sheen of black oil. He wiped it on his clothes in panic, but the sensation clung to his skin, burning cold. Then came the voice. At first, Arun thought it was the sorcerer whispering to himself again, but this was different. It was softer, closer, a woman's voice, low and broken, seeping directly into his ears. "Feed me." Arun jerked his head around. No one was there. The sorcerer had returned to his trance, ignoring him completely, his whole attention locked on the larger jar tied with string. "Feed me," the voice repeated, this time clearer, hungrier. Arun stumbled to his feet, heart hammering so hard it felt like it would tear from his chest. The jar trembled in place. The candle flame stretched toward it like a finger reaching out. And then, impossibly, a thin shape began to rise from the jar itself, a shimmer, like smoke made solid. It formed into the outline of a face, a woman's face. The features were blurred, as though submerged underwater, but Arun could see her eyes, dark, empty sockets that seemed to pull him in. The sorcerer snarled and slammed his palm down onto the larger jar, breaking his chant only long enough to spit out words Arun couldn't understand. His voice was harsh, commanding, yet the smoke face turned toward Arun instead. Hungry. The sound of it ripped through his skull, more felt than heard. His body moved before he could think, his hand reaching instinctively for the knife the sorcerer had used before. The jar pulsed in response, vibrating against the floor. Arun realized, with a wave of horror, that it was not asking for incense or blood from the sorcerer. It wanted something from him. The walls of the house groaned. Outside, dogs barked in frenzy, then fell silent one by one, their voices cutting short as though strangled. Arun stumbled backward, but the room shifted with him, the shadows stretching, the candlelight bending. The jars along the wall rattled violently, some tipping over, spilling dark streaks across the floor. The smell intensified, sharp enough to make his eyes water. "Feed me," the voice demanded again, louder now. The face pushed further out of the jar, its form becoming clearer. He could see strands of wet hair clinging to her cheeks, lips cracked and torn, a faint line around her throat, as if from a noose. Arun's thoughts spiraled. Was this the source of the oil? A woman who had died violently, her spirit trapped inside forever, forced to obey whoever carried her remains. The sorcerer finally looked at him, his face pale, his lips trembling as though he too had lost control. "Do not listen," he barked. "If you feed her once, she will never leave you." Arun's knees buckled. The knife slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor. The woman's face twisted into something like a smile, a crack running across her lips to reveal blackened teeth. Suddenly, the large jar at the far end of the room shook violently, the red string snapping with a sharp pop. The sorcerer screamed and lunged toward it, his body half covering the jar as it rocked and bucked beneath him. Arun's jar pulsed harder in response, oil leaking freely now, spreading like veins across the floorboards. Both presences filled the room at once. The air shook with whispers, dozens of voices layered over one another, rising into a chorus of hunger and command. Arun clutched his head, desperate to block them out, but they pressed deeper, clawing at his thoughts, stripping away reason. For the first time, he understood why the villagers looked at him with fear. This wasn't just a charm or even a curse. This was possession. To take Nam Man Phrai was to chain yourself to the restless dead, and once chained, there was no escape. And yet, even as the truth burned in his mind, Arun felt his own hand moving again, against his will, reaching for the jar that had chosen him. Arun's trembling hand hovered inches above the jar, when the sorcerer let out a cry that split the silence like a blade. The old man hurled himself forward, seizing Arun's wrist with a grip far stronger than his frail frame suggested. His eyes were wide, almost white, his mouth foaming with the strain of his chants. "Don't," the sorcerer gasped. "You must not answer her." The voice in Arun's head hissed louder, angrier now. "He lies. Feed me." Arun's vision blurred, caught between two forces pulling at him from opposite ends. The sorcerer's nails dug into his flesh, grounding him in pain, But the whisper was intimate, wrapping around him like a lover's breath, promising relief if only he obeyed. Then, in a moment of strange clarity, Aaron saw something he hadn't noticed before. The oil spreading from the jar wasn't random. It was forming shapes, lines, curling into symbols across the floorboards. He recognized one of them. It was nearly identical to an etching he had seen years earlier, carved into a bone charm said to bind spirits to the living. Aaron's throat went dry. "She's trapped, isn't she?" The sorcerer's grip tightened, his voice hoarse. "Not trapped. Bound. Do you know how Nam Man Phrai is made? You think it is only oil? It is more. It is the soul of a woman who died in violence. The unborn life she carried, their pain, their hunger, it is burned into the oil. Each drop is a mouth that never stops asking." Arun's stomach turned. He had heard rumors, but hearing it laid out like this made his blood run cold. He glanced at the shadowy face leaking from the jar, its hollow eyes locked onto him. Now the whispers made sense. They weren't random hauntings. They were pleas, the echoes of someone who had been torn from life in the most horrific way. The sorcerer's voice dropped lower, urgent. Every owner thinks they can control it. They believe if they give it food, blood, incense, it will serve them. At first it does. Fortune comes. Love bends to their will. Enemies fall. But it is not loyalty. It is hunger. And hunger grows. Always grows. The symbols on the floor stretched longer, curling toward Arun's feet like roots searching for soil. He scrambled back, but the oily lines followed, inching closer no matter how he moved. "Why me?" Arun demanded, voice cracking. "Why does it want me?" The sorcerer's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Because you touched it. The first touch is enough. You gave it permission." Arun's mind reeled. Permission? All he had done was place his fingers on the jar for less than a second. Yet, in that moment, a pact had already begun. That explained the villager's stares, the old woman's warning, the young man's desperate plea. They hadn't been afraid of what he might buy. They were afraid because the choice had already been made for him. The voice in his skull turned sharp, angry. "Don't listen, he fears me. But I will give you what you want. Riches, love, power, just one offering, and it begins." Arun pressed his palms to his ears, but the voice only grew louder, vibrating inside his chest. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But part of him still lingered on her promises. The sorcerer shook him, dragging him back from the edge of his thoughts. "Look at me. Do you know why the oil stinks? Why it smells like rot? Because it remembers. It remembers burning. It remembers the candle held beneath its flesh, the prayers spoken as it dripped. That stench will follow you until the day you die, if you accept her." Arun gagged, the sour, sweet odor filling his lungs until he could barely breathe. The idea of living with that smell, with that hunger gnawing at him day and night, made his skin crawl. The sorcerer released his wrist and staggered to the shelves. He grabbed a bundle of dried herbs and flung them onto the candle's flame. A burst of smoke filled the room, acrid and biting, sending the shadows writhing across the walls. The woman's face recoiled, her hollow eyes narrowing in fury. The oily tendrils on the floor hissed, curling back as if burned. For the first time, the whispers dimmed. Aaron sucked in a breath of air that almost felt clean, though the stink still clung faintly. The sorcerer slumped against the wall, wheezing, his strength nearly spent. "Incense weakens it, not forever, but long enough. Do you see now? This is not a gift, it is a prison, and every owner becomes its jailer until the day it devours them." Arun stared at the jar, bile rising in his throat. The face inside had not vanished completely. It hovered in the smoke, lips pulled back in a snarl, and in that expression, Arun saw the truth. The woman was no servant. She was rage. She was grief sharpened into a blade, seeking anyone foolish enough to pick it up. He thought of the gambler the sorcerer had mentioned, the man who lost his family overnight. He thought of the villagers' silence, their refusal to even speak the name aloud. And for the first time, Arun understood why. This wasn't just superstition. This was a pact with death itself. And now, whether he accepted it or not, death was already watching him. Arun staggered out of the sorcerer's house before dawn, his body weak, his mind raw. The sky was still dark, the horizon just beginning to bruise with the first light of morning. He wanted nothing more than to put distance between himself and that cursed place. To scrub the stench of oil from his skin. To silence the whispers still echoing faintly in his ears. The village was awake earlier than before. Men stood in small groups, watching him with hard, knowing eyes. Women pulled their children indoors as he passed, shutting doors with a finality that made his stomach twist. It was clear, they already believed he was marked. He walked quickly, almost running, back toward the dirt road that would take him to the bus. His hands shook uncontrollably, and every few steps he swore he felt something damp against his palm. He wiped it furiously on his trousers, but when he looked, there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest shimmer, as if a thin layer of oil still clung to his skin no matter how much he rubbed. At the edge of the village, he heard it again. The voice, softer this time, less demanding, almost tender. "You touched me. You carry me now." Arun spun around, but the road was empty. Only the wind moved through the fields, bending the rice stalks in waves. His chest tightened as the realization sank deeper. The sorcerer's incense, the villagers' warnings, it had only delayed her, not freed him. The bus finally appeared, rattling down the road in a cloud of dust. Arun stepped aboard, slid into a seat, and pressed his face to the glass. As the village disappeared behind him, he told himself it was over. That distance would be enough. But then he felt it. A faint warmth against his chest, right where his bag hung. He opened it slowly, hands trembling, though he already knew what he would find. Nestled between his clothes, slick and gleaming, was the clay jar. The lid pulsed once as if in greeting, and the voice whispered, calm and certain, "We're together now." The tale of Nam Man Phrai leaves us with a chilling truth. Sometimes the most terrifying spirits aren't born, they're created. And in Thailand, that belief doesn't end with cursed oils drawn from the dead. It extends to something even stranger, something deliberately shaped by human hands. Where Nam Man Phrai is liquid hunger, bound in a jar, the Hun Payont is hunger carved into form, a man-made ghost given flesh through wood, metal, or rattan. One promises fortune and power if you keep it fed. The other promises protection or vengeance, depending on how it's treated. Both blur the line between devotion and damnation. And if the oil of the dead whispers, the effigy does something worse. It walks. The second story begins with a man named Kiet, a craftsman from Ayutthaya whose skill with carving was known across the region. By trade, he made furniture, tables, chairs, and small shrines for temples. His hands were steady, his eye for detail unmatched. But though he was respected for his craft, Kiet was not content. Business was faltering, customers were few. In the shadow of larger workshops, his name was easily forgotten. Kiet's troubles worsened after a string of thefts swept through his neighborhood. Tools disappeared from his workshop, food vanished from his doorstep, and one night even his offerings at the spirit house were stolen. Each morning, he found himself more anxious, more desperate. Neighbors whispered that the thieves were protected by charms, that police could do little. But one evening, as Kiet drank rice whiskey with an older carpenter, he heard of a different kind of solution. Not a charm, not a talisman, something alive. "They call it Hun Payont," the old man muttered. his eyes darting as if afraid the walls might be listening. Effigies that walk, carved from wood or woven from rattan, breathed into with spells. They guard their masters. They fight back. Kiet laughed at first, but the old man's tone held no humor. He described how monks of ancient times created them as protectors for temples and homes, loyal guardians that could be placed at a doorway or buried beneath a threshold. Yet he also whispered of darker versions, effigies stuffed with corpse oil or bone ash, their loyalty bought with something unholy. Those ones, he warned, did not just protect, they could attack. The idea took root in Kiet's mind and would not leave. He was a carver. If anyone could shape such an effigy, surely he could. And what did he have to lose? His tools were nearly gone. His money was dwindling. Even the respect of his neighbors was slipping away with every theft. So one night, beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp, Kiet began to carve. He chose a block of tamarind wood, dark and heavy, its grain smooth beneath his blade. He shaped it into the form of a small figure, no taller than his forearm, its arms crossed, its mouth etched into a grim line. The work came easily, almost too easily, as though his hands were guided by something unseen. When at last the figure sat complete on his bench, he felt a strange weight in the room. But carving was only the beginning. He remembered the old carpenter's words about witcher, sacred spells, and yantra inscriptions. So he studied, searching scraps of manuscripts, tracing old diagrams he found in temple libraries. He inked lines of script across the effigy's chest and back, curling symbols that seemed to writhe under the lamplight. And then came the final step, the breath mantra. He leaned close, whispered the words he had learned, and breathed into its wooden mouth. The lamp flickered, the air shifted, and for a heartbeat, Kiet thought he saw the effigy's eyes gleam. Uneasy, he placed it at the corner of his workshop, muttered a prayer, and tried to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. The silence of the night was broken by faint creaks, as though the floorboards shifted beneath a weight too light to see. More than once he rose, checked the door, the windows, the figure itself. Each time it was exactly where he had left it. And yet, as the hours crawled past, Kiet could not shake the feeling he was no longer alone. By dawn, exhaustion claimed him. But before his eyes closed, he swore he heard it. 3 soft knocks against the door, slow and deliberate, followed by the sound of small feet retreating into silence. The first days after Kiet completed the effigy were eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, no tools went missing, no food disappeared from his doorstep. He told himself it was coincidence, that perhaps the thieves had simply moved on. Still, each night before bed, he placed a small cup of rice, whiskey, and a stick of incense before the Hun Payont, just as the old carpenter had suggested. He did it half as a ritual, half as a joke, muttering, "Here, take this, and keep my home safe." But on the third night, something happened that broke the fragile sense of calm. Kiet awoke to the sound of wood knocking against wood. Not loud, not frantic. 3 measured knocks, steady, like a visitor at the door. He froze in his bed, straining to listen. Again, the knocks came, slow and deliberate. Gathering his courage, he lit a lantern and crept to the front of the house. When he opened the door, no one was there. The street lay empty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. He stepped outside, lantern raised, but found nothing. No footprints in the dust, no movement in the shadows. He returned inside, uneasy, and set the lantern down, only to notice something that made his blood run cold. The Hun Payont was no longer where he had left it. It had been sitting at the far corner of his workshop, facing the wall. Now it stood just beside the doorframe, as if it had been waiting for him to answer the knocks. Kiet's mouth went dry. He wanted to believe he had moved it earlier and simply forgotten, but the way it leaned slightly, the way its carved face seemed to tilt toward him, it felt intentional. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat on his mat, staring at the effigy, watching for the smallest twitch. But the figure remained still, wooden and lifeless, until the first rays of dawn spilled into the workshop. The following day, word spread through the village that one of the local thieves had been badly injured. They said he was found near the river, his arm broken in 2 places, his body covered in scratches too deep to be from an animal. When asked what had happened, the boy muttered only one thing before falling silent. "A little man followed me." Kiet listened to the gossip in silence, a shiver crawling down his spine. He tried to dismiss it, but when he returned home that evening, he found the cup of rice whiskey he had left as an offering was empty. Not spilled, not evaporated. Empty, as though someone or something had drunk it. That night, the knocking returned. 3 knocks. A pause. Then another 3. Kiet sat rigid on his bed, gripping the edge of his blanket, refusing to move. The sound seemed to echo through the wooden beams, filling every corner of the house. And though he didn't open the door, he could hear faint footsteps retreating afterward, like the padding of small bare feet across the floor. By morning, he was pale and restless, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. He considered dismantling the effigy, burning it, throwing it into the river. But when he stood before it, chisel in hand, he froze. The carved figure stared back at him with blank wooden eyes, yet in that blankness, he felt something alive, something watching. He lowered the chisel slowly, unable to strike. That same afternoon, the old carpenter who had first told him of the Hun Payont passed by his workshop. When Kiet mentioned, half joking, that he had carved one for himself, the man's face drained of color. His hand shook as he grasped Kiet's arm. "You didn't just carve it, did you?" the old man whispered. "You breathed it. You gave it life." Kiet didn't answer. He didn't need to. The carpenter's trembling was enough to confirm the truth Kiet was too afraid to admit. "You must be careful," the man continued, voice low. "Treat it like a child. Feed it. Speak kindly to it. Never, ever ignore it, because once it believes it has been abandoned," his voice faltered, "it will remind you that it can walk on its own." That night, the offerings were taken again, and though Kiet never moved it, he awoke to find the Hun Payont standing closer to his bed, watching. Always watching. By the end of the week, Kiet's workshop no longer felt like his own. The Hun Payont had become a presence in every room, though it never moved when he watched. It was always afterward. He would leave it by the front door in the evening, only to find it near his bed by morning. Or he would place it in the corner of the workshop, and hours later it would be standing at the base of his spirit house outside, as if it had wandered there of its own accord. The neighbors began to notice changes, too. More than one villager swore they heard footsteps circling Kiet's house at night, quick and pattering like those of a child. Dogs barked furiously at the darkened windows, their hackles raised, only to whimper and retreat as if something unseen had stared back at them. One evening, a knock came at his door, not the hollow taps of the effigy, but heavy fists, urgent and angry. When Kiet opened it, he found the young man from the neighboring house, his face pale with fear and rage. "You brought it here," the man hissed. "We hear it walking, we hear it knocking. My daughter woke screaming last night," she said. A small man was standing at her bedside. "If you don't get rid of it, I will." Kiet tried to argue, to insist that the Hun Payont was only a carved figure, nothing more. But even as he spoke, he caught sight of it over the man's shoulder, standing just beyond the doorway. It hadn't been there when he opened the door. Its blank eyes stared outward, silent, almost daring the man to step closer. The villager recoiled, muttered a curse under his breath, and stormed away. Kiet closed the door quickly, his heart racing, his throat dry. That night, he gave the Hun Payont double the offerings, 2 cups of whiskey, 2 sticks of incense, a plate of fruit. He whispered to it as though it could hear. "You protect me, don't you? You wouldn't harm me." But even as he spoke, he felt foolish, desperate, like a man bargaining with shadows. The next strange event came only a few nights later. Kiet woke to a sound not of knocking, but of laughter. Faint, high-pitched, like a child's giggle drifting through the rafters. He rose from his bed, heart thundering, and followed the sound into the workshop. There, in the faint moonlight seeping through the shutters, he saw the effigy. It was seated cross-legged on his workbench, one tiny hand resting on a chisel. The fruit and whiskey he had left earlier were gone, the plates licked clean. As he stepped closer, the giggle ceased, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against his skull. The Hun Payont didn't move, yet he swore its head had turned ever so slightly toward him. By morning, he could no longer ignore what was happening. He sought out the old carpenter again, the one who had first whispered of the effigy. But when he explained how it moved, how it ate, how others had seen it, the old man refused to meet his eyes. "You have gone too far," the carpenter muttered. "If it has taken offerings, it already thinks itself alive. You cannot treat it like wood anymore. It has a will, it has needs. And if you fail it—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "There are reasons even the monks stopped making them." Kiet pressed him for more, desperate, but the man only gave him one final warning. "Do not let it feel abandoned, and do not let it grow stronger. If it walks too freely, it will no longer guard only your home. It will guard itself." That evening, Kiet returned shaken, his mind swirling with fear. The villagers glared at him from doorways, children pulled inside at the sight of him. Even the dogs no longer barked, they only whimpered when he passed. His workshop felt colder now, the shadows longer, and though he left his offerings as usual, he noticed something new. On the wall above, where the Hun Payont stood, small handprints had appeared, not carved, not painted, smeared in something dark, as though a child with filthy hands had pressed against the wood. But Kiet lived alone. Kiet barely recognized his life anymore. Days blurred into nights, and nights into long hours of silence broken only by knocks, footsteps, and faint laughter. The effigy was no longer just a figure carved from wood. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to grow stronger with every offering he gave it. That night, the air was heavy, a storm pressing down on the village. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the true weight in the room came from the Hun Payont. Kiet had placed it by the spirit house outside, hoping to give himself a night of peace. But as the rain began to fall, he woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps inside his workshop. Not the heavy tread of an intruder. These were lighter, quicker, scurrying across the floorboards like bare feet. His heart leapt into his throat. He grabbed the lantern beside his bed, lighting it with trembling hands. The flame sputtered, then grew, casting long shadows across the walls. And there it was. The Hun Payont was no longer outside. It stood in the center of the workshop, drenched from the rain, water dripping from its carved body. Its wooden face was expressionless, yet its posture seemed different, more upright, more human. Kiet froze. He wanted to speak, to command it back to its place, but no words came. Instead, a knock echoed through the house. 3 slow raps. Not at the door this time, but on the inside wall, just a few feet behind him. He spun around, lantern raised, but the wall was bare. The knocks came again, this time from the ceiling above. Then again, from the floor beneath his feet. The sound surrounded him, spreading through the beams and rafters, until the entire house seemed to pulse with it. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Enough!" For a moment, the noise ceased. The silence was worse. In that silence, Kiet heard something he had never heard before, breathing. Slow, rasping breaths, as though someone were crouched just behind him. He whipped around. But the room was empty, except for the effigy, still standing in the center, its wet body gleaming in the lantern light. Then the lantern flickered. For the briefest second, he swore the effigy had shifted. Its head tilted just slightly, its carved mouth pulled upward into the faintest suggestion of a smile. The lantern flame steadied, and the figure was as it had been, still and blank. But Kiet's blood ran cold. He knew what he had seen. Desperate, he backed toward the spirit house outside, clutching the lantern like a shield. He whispered a prayer, one he had not spoken since he was a child, hoping the gods might hear. The rain pelted down harder, washing mud across the yard. But when he turned back toward the workshop, he froze. There were footprints in the mud. Small, bare footprints. Dozens of them. Circling the house, leading from the door to the windows and back again. They weren't his. They couldn't be. Suddenly, a crash came from inside. His chisels clattered to the floor, his tools scattering as though hurled by invisible hands. He rushed back in, and what he saw made his stomach twist. The effigy was no longer alone. Shadows clung to the walls, thin and childlike, their limbs too long, their movements jerky. They darted in and out of the lantern light, flickering like smoke. He counted 3, then 4, then lost track, as they swirled around him, whispering in voices too soft to understand. And at the center of it all, the Hun Payont stood taller now, its form no longer a simple carving, but something animated, its arms twitching with unnatural stiffness. Kiet stumbled backward, tripping over his own tools. The whispers grew louder, words finally forming. "Father, don't leave us." Hungry. His breath caught. They weren't just voices, they were pleas. The effigy wasn't just protecting him, it was drawing something in, feeding on it, and now whatever it had called was filling his home. The old carpenter's warning echoed in his mind. Do not let it grow stronger. If it walks too freely, it will no longer guard only your home. It will guard itself. And now, as the shadows pressed closer, as the effigy took one stiff step forward, Kiet realized with a sickening clarity that it no longer belonged to him at all. The lantern flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness, and in that moment, Kiet felt a small wooden hand grip his ankle. Kiet scrambled in the dark, clawing at the floorboards, trying to free his leg from the grip around his ankle. His hand brushed the lantern, and in a frantic motion, he struck the flint until sparks caught. The flame flared weakly, casting trembling light across the room. What he saw made his breath hitch in his throat. The Hun Payont stood just inches away, its hand clamped around his leg. Its wooden fingers dug into his flesh with impossible strength, leaving bruises where they pressed. But worse than its grip was its face. The carved expression hadn't changed, but behind the blank eyes, something moved. A shimmer, a depth that wasn't wood at all, as though something else looked out from within. Around them, the childlike shadows scattered into the corners, hissing softly, their whispers fading but not gone. Kiet pulled harder, kicking desperately until the effigy finally released him. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the lantern like a weapon, its meager flame barely holding back the thick dark pressing against the walls. "You wanted a guardian," a voice whispered. It wasn't from the shadows. It wasn't even from the Hun Payont. It came from somewhere deeper, seeping directly into his ears. "You gave it life, you fed it, now it is yours. And you are its." "I do," Kiet shook his head violently. "No, I never." But then it struck him. Every offering, every cup of whiskey, every stick of incense, every muttered word of thanks. He hadn't just been performing rituals. He had been nurturing it, acknowledging it as living, and in doing so, he had bound himself to it. He remembered the carpenter's warning, treat it like a child. It hadn't been a metaphor. The effigy believed he was its parent, that he was responsible for its existence, and like a child, it had grown not into innocence, but into hunger. The Hun Payont tilted its head. Slowly, stiffly, it raised one arm and pointed to the spirit house outside. Its wooden hand trembled, but the gesture was clear. Kiet's chest tightened. He moved to the door, lantern shaking in his grip, and stepped into the rain. The muddy yard glistened under the weak flame, but something new caught his eye. The spirit house, once a shrine for protective deities, was covered in the same smeared handprints he had seen earlier on his workshop wall. Dozens of them, small and dark, layered over one another until the wood was blackened with marks. A faint giggle drifted from inside the shrine. Kiet staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He understood now why the villagers feared it. The Hun Payont wasn't simply guarding his home, it was replacing what the spirits once did. It wasn't a protector, it was a usurper, feeding on offerings, pushing out anything sacred, building a dominion of its own. You gave it breath, the voice whispered again. And so it breathes. You gave it food. And so it hungers. You gave it love. And so it wants more. His knees weakened. He thought of the boy by the river, broken, scratched, muttering about a little man who had followed him. He thought of the villagers' children waking to see it by their beds. He had believed it was guarding him, punishing thieves in his name. But what if it wasn't acting for him at all? What if it was acting for itself, extending its reach, its influence, its appetite? The carpenter's words returned like a curse. If it walks too freely, it will no longer guard only your home. It will guard itself. Kiet turned back toward the workshop, toward the effigy still standing in the doorway. Water dripped from its wooden body, puddling at its feet. Its arms hung limply, but its head tilted in a way that almost seemed expectant. Waiting. Waiting. And Kiet realized the most terrifying part of all. It hadn't rebelled. Not yet. It still thought of him as master, as father, but that bond cut both ways. He was its caretaker, its feeder, its jailer. And the moment he failed in that duty, the moment it felt abandoned, then, and only then, would it turn. The whispers swelled again, the voices of children weaving through the rain, surrounding him in a chorus that made his skin crawl. Don't leave us. Don't leave us. Don't leave us. Kiet stumbled backward into the mud, lantern shaking wildly in his grip. He wanted to destroy it, to burn it, to smash it to pieces. But another thought rooted him to the ground, more paralyzing than the fear itself. What if breaking the effigy didn't end it? What if it only freed whatever lived inside? The Hun Payont stood unmoving, patient, as if it already knew the answer. He dared not speak. Kiet didn't remember how long he stood in the rain, lantern flickering, the Hun Payont framed in the doorway like a sentinel. Thunder cracked above the village, shaking the earth beneath his feet, but still the effigy did not move. It only watched, its carved head tilted slightly, the faint sheen of water dripping from its body like sweat. At last, Kiet turned and ran. He didn't bother to gather his tools or lock the workshop. He stumbled through the mud, past the rows of darkened houses, the whispers of children's voices following him with every step. Don't leave us! Don't leave us! By the time he reached the edge of the village, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. He paused, gasping for breath, certain that if he looked back, he would see the effigy standing behind him. But the road was empty, just fields, stretching endlessly into the night. Relief began to creep in, until he noticed his bag felt heavier. Trembling, he opened it. Inside, tucked neatly between his spare clothes, was the Hun Payont. Its wooden eyes stared up at him, water still dripping from its carved frame as though it had followed him there. Kiet dropped the bag, heart hammering, and stumbled backward. But before he could run, the voices rose again, louder now, surrounding him in every direction, dozens of them, hundreds. Father, don't abandon us. We walk with you. The effigy shifted slightly in the bag, its limbs bending just enough to prove it was no longer bound by wood alone. Kiet's scream tore into the night, swallowed quickly by the fields, and when silence returned, the only sound was the faint knock of wooden hands against the earth, steady, deliberate, and moving closer. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.